It was a warm evening in late spring when my dad and his friend decided to take a hiking trip through rural France. They were young, full of energy, and a bit careless. Something I now understand as the sort of recklessness you only get when you're in your 20s. They weren't exactly seasoned hikers, but they had a passion for adventure. It was a spontaneous decision, really. They were staying in a small village and had spent the day shopping for supplies and exploring the local streets. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, and although they didn't realize it then, the clock was ticking. They had set out on a narrow trail leading into the woods, thinking they would find a nice spot to pitch their tent before nightfall. The trees were dense, their branches stretching high above, casting shadows across the trail as the light began to fade. It wasn't a long hike, but they hadn't expected to lose track of time. As evening approached, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder with each step. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, and the sound of distant flowing water echoed faintly through the woods. The type of peaceful ambience you'd expect from a rural French forest. They didn't have a flashlight or any kind of light source. It was one of those things they thought about but didn't act on. "We'll be fine," they told each other. The moon was bright, casting enough light for them to see the trail ahead. They felt confident, even though they knew night was creeping in faster than they had anticipated. As the last light of day vanished, they came to a point where the path widened. The trees thinned out a bit, and the ground changed from hard, forest floor dirt to soft grass. They stopped for a moment, looking around in the dim light. "This looks like a good spot," my dad recalled his friend saying, a bit uncertain but optimistic. There was something about the area that felt odd, though. It wasn't the type of forest clearing they had expected. It was larger than they thought, and the grass underneath their boots wasn't the dry, fallen leaves they had become accustomed to. There was something strange about the way the moonlight reflected off the grass, making it almost glow faintly. But they didn't think too much of it. They were tired from the hike, and the thought of pitching the tent and getting some rest was enough to convince them that they had found their spot. So, they set up their tent on the grass, trying to ignore the eerie feeling that was starting to settle in their stomachs. They unrolled their sleeping bags, ate some quick snacks, and talked for a bit before they both settled down to sleep. The sounds of the forest had softened by now, replaced by the distant hum of insects and the occasional rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was this strange feeling in the air, like something was off. It wasn't enough to alarm them, though. They shrugged it off as fatigue and drifted off to sleep. The night was uneventful at first. My dad remembers waking up a few times, not to anything specific, just that feeling you sometimes get when you stir in your sleep, like the world outside your tent is shifting, but you can't put your finger on why. He heard the sound of wind and branches creaking, but that was nothing out of the ordinary. It was only when the loud, roaring sound of engines cut through the quiet that they both jumped awake, their hearts racing in their chests. The sound came out of nowhere, close, too close. It was so loud, my dad thought for a moment that the ground itself was shaking. He sat up quickly, eyes wide, his heart pounding. His friend did the same, and they both scrambled out of their sleeping bags, unzipping the tent in a panic. They were so disoriented, they didn't even know which way was up. The noise was deafening now, the sound of multiple engines roaring, accompanied by the screeching of metal and the whirring of something large moving nearby. My dad remembers feeling an intense rush of adrenaline. His mind raced. Were they being attacked? Were there people nearby with machines that had come to trap them? Everything felt wrong. They didn't have a flashlight, and there wasn't enough light to make sense of their surroundings. The only thing they could make out was the vague outline of the grass beneath their feet and the dark silhouettes of trees around them. "Get up. We need to move," my dad's friend said, his voice shaky. My dad didn't question it. They scrambled to pack up the tent, fumbling through the darkness, trying to make sense of their situation. The noise was still there, like a powerful, unstoppable force drawing closer, and they didn't have any idea what it was or where it was coming from. They managed to get the tent packed up in a frenzy, but as they were about to head off into the woods, they finally looked around them. The panic began to subside, just enough for them to realize something strange. They weren't surrounded by the trees they had assumed were behind them. In fact, they weren't even on a trail anymore. The ground beneath their feet was smooth, flat, and paved, not at all like the rough terrain they'd hiked through earlier. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The engines went silent, and the quiet of the night rushed in, almost too suddenly. It was then that they realized, with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, that they had pitched their tent on the middle of a road. The two of them froze, wide-eyed and breathless. They looked around, their brains struggling to process what they were seeing. The grass beneath them was not part of the forest clearing they had imagined. It was part of a roundabout in the middle of road construction. The noise they had heard wasn't some impending threat, but the sound of heavy machinery starting up to warn them that they had set up camp in the midst of an active construction zone. The two construction workers, who had been sitting in the cabs of their vehicles with their engines running, had clearly seen the two men in the tent and had started their machines in an attempt to get them to leave. The workers had likely been startled to see people camping in the middle of a roundabout, but they were too polite, or maybe too confused, to confront them directly. Instead, they had turned on the engines, revved the motors, and waited for the two young hikers to wake up and realize their mistake. When my dad and his friend finally registered what was happening, they couldn't help but laugh, albeit nervously. They were still shaken from the experience, but the absurdity of it all hit them at once. Here they were, in the middle of a construction zone on a roundabout of all places, thinking they were in some sort of danger. They quickly packed up their gear, embarrassed but relieved. As they stumbled out of the roundabout and back into the forest, they couldn't stop laughing. It was the kind of nervous laughter that only comes from realizing just how close you were to doing something incredibly stupid. In the light of day, they took a look at their surroundings. It was clear now that they had been on a path leading to a small construction site, a roundabout in the making. The area was surrounded by trees, and they had just missed seeing the workers' equipment scattered around, hidden by the darkness of night. They never did find the perfect campsite that night, but after the ordeal, they were just glad to be alive and safe, free of any real danger. The rest of their trip was uneventful, and though they laughed about it many times over the years, my dad still refers to it as his scariest camping experience. Not because of the danger they were in, but because of how quickly everything had escalated from peaceful to terrifying. That night in rural France was a lesson in being prepared and not taking anything for granted, especially when you're far from home and in the middle of the unknown. And as for the construction workers, they probably had a good laugh of their own the next day when they saw two tired, confused hikers wandering off into the woods, forever changed by their little adventure. We used to go out to Wilmington, Ohio every summer. My grandfather had the second house out there, and it was like a whole different world compared to Cincinnati, where we lived. Wilmington was as country as you could get. The land was all wide open, with cornfields that seemed to stretch forever, and the house sat on a good chunk of land with a huge pond that always had a ton of fish in it. Every summer, we'd have cookouts out there, family gathered around, grilling and fishing, enjoying the peace and quiet. My brother and I, we were just kids, maybe 8 or 9, and we loved to explore. The woods around the house were dense, with thick trees that seemed to go on forever, and the kind of underbrush that was perfect for hiding and pretending we were on some big adventure. We'd run around, climbing trees, making up stories where we were knights battling dragons or soldiers on a secret mission. The woods were our playground, and we'd go deeper and deeper into them, finding new spots every time. But one year, I'll never forget that year, it was different. Something about the woods felt off, like they were hiding something, like something had changed. It started when we were walking along one of our usual trails, the one that ran behind the pond, and we noticed something strange. There was this little clearing off to the side of the trail, and as we got closer, we saw a camp setup. It wasn't just some tent and a campfire like you'd expect. This was weird. The first thing that hit me was the symbols. They were all over the trees, painted right on the trunks, some of them in dark, jagged strokes that looked almost like they'd been scratched into the bark. Others were like spray-painted symbols, too clean, too fresh. Some of them were in a circle, others scattered, almost like a pattern, but it was so chaotic that it gave me this uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had no idea what they meant, but the way they were arranged, it felt like someone was trying to summon something. But that wasn't the craziest thing. No, the weirdest part was the school bus. A full-sized, old yellow school bus. It was hoisted up between two massive trees, about 30 feet off the ground. Like how? How did they even get a bus up there? I remember standing there, staring at it, trying to wrap my head around it. It was too bizarre. The trees were huge, sure, but this wasn't something you just pulled off with a couple of ropes. The bus was sitting in the trees like some kind of messed up treehouse, and I swear, it looked like it had been up there for a while. There were patches of moss and dirt on it, and the metal looked rusted. My brother was already thinking the same thing I was. Something wasn't right here. But we were kids, and we always had this sense of curiosity. We were both too nervous to go up and knock on the door of the bus or anything, but we walked closer. The ground was soft and muddy from all the rain earlier, so it felt even more eerie. It was like the woods were swallowing us up. We walked around the bus, but then we saw it. There was a small table set up under a canopy of branches, and more symbols were painted on it, like someone had been doing some kind of ritual or ceremony there. The table had a few objects on it. A strange-looking knife, some candles, and some old jars. My brother and I didn't touch anything, but we sure stared at it for a long time. I can still see those jars in my mind, the kind of glass that looked old, almost like they belonged in a lab, and I kept wondering what could be inside them. There was a tent too, and it was the same as everything else. Symbols painted all over it, almost like the people who set up camp were trying to leave a message or mark their territory. The tent wasn't anything fancy, just a plain old canvas tent. But the symbols made it look like something straight out of a horror movie. There was a part of me that wanted to go inside, see what was in there. But then I thought about those symbols again, and my stomach twisted. I had no idea who was out there or what kind of people did this, but something in me just told me that we shouldn't be messing with it. So we turned around and we didn't look back. But that wasn't the end of it. On our way out of the woods, we noticed something else. A shantytown. Right there in the middle of the woods, as if it had been dropped in from another world. The houses were all made of scrap metal, old pieces of sheet metal nailed together to form makeshift walls. Some of the homes looked like they had been there for years, others looked like they were freshly built. There were clothes hanging out to dry, sheets flapping in the breeze. It was a strange sight, and as we walked through it, we kept our eyes peeled for any movement, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, not even footprints in the dirt. It was like whoever lived there was just gone. We made it back to the house, our hearts still racing. But it wasn't like we could just forget what we'd seen. The images of that bus in the trees, the weird symbols, the shantytown, it all stayed with me. I didn't talk much about it to my brother after that. Neither of us really knew what to say. I think we both knew it was one of those things that was better left alone, better left forgotten. After that trip, we never went back into those woods. A year or so later, my grandfather sold the place. I don't know why, but I've always wondered if he knew something we didn't. He never really talked about it. But there was something in the way he acted when we brought it up, like he was hiding something, like he knew more than he was willing to share. Maybe it was just because of the property value dropping, or maybe it was the memories. But I've always felt like there was something else going on out there, something I wasn't supposed to know. What gets me, though, is the school bus. Every now and then, I'll be driving through the woods near Wilmington, and I'll think about it. I'll picture that bus hanging in the trees, high up and unreachable. I'll wonder how it got there, what kind of people would do something like that, and why it looked like they'd been living out there for so long. I guess I'll never really know. It was one of those long, hot July afternoons where even the shade offered no comfort. I was working up in the Sierra Nevada mountains at a wilderness scout camp. Not one of those neatly trimmed, family-friendly places either. This was real backcountry, remote, rugged, and dry as bone. We'd been warned about fire season, of course. That kind of warning's part of the job. You hear it so often, it almost becomes background noise. But that summer, everything felt one notch tighter. The heat held on longer into the day, and even the dirt underfoot felt like it had been baking since May. I was leading a small group of scouts, middle schoolers mostly, on a trail lesson a couple miles out from the main camp. Nothing crazy, just some basic navigation and tracking, keeping them busy, trying to get them to think about the land they were moving through. We were in a pocket of old-growth forest, mostly ponderosa and sugar pine. Big trees, giants, the kind of trees that make you feel small in a good way, like the world's been turning a long time before you got here, and it'll keep going after you're gone. We were about to turn back when I caught the faintest whiff of smoke. Not campfire smoke. Something sharper, more chemical, but buried under layers of forest smell. Sap, dry needles, sun-cooked earth. I paused, held up a hand. The kids settled quick, maybe sensing the change in my body language. I stepped off the trail toward a tree whose base looked off. The bark didn't look burnt, not black or cracked, but there was this strange heat shimmer around it. I knelt, brushed back the pine needles and duff, and sure enough, smoke. Thin tendrils of it curling up from the earth itself. My first thought was that some kids from another troop had been sneaking cigarettes and tried to hide it. Wouldn't be the first time, but something didn't sit right. I cleared more away, and the smell got worse, deeper. Not fresh burning, but the kind of scorched smell you get when something's been smoldering, trapped. I dug a little deeper, just with my hands at first, and the soil was hot. Not just warm, hot enough that I yanked my hand back on instinct. It felt like sticking your fingers on a hot frying pan for a second too long. I told 2 of the older scouts to run back to Camp HQ and let them know what we found. I didn't want to panic the kids, but I also knew I couldn't just ignore it. I stayed there, watching the base of the tree like it might come alive, because honestly, it felt like it might. The rest of the group stayed behind me, quiet, probably picking up on the fact that I wasn't saying much. It didn't take long before a couple of the older staff showed up, one of the assistant directors, a maintenance guy, and another leader. They brought shovels and a few hand tools. We started digging, not frantically, carefully. The dirt wasn't just warm near the surface. It was hot 2-3 feet down. The roots of the tree, thick as my arm, were scorched and glowing in places. Bright red, just under the surface. One of the guys muttered something about a root fire, and that's when it all snapped into place. A root fire, for those who don't know, is a slow underground burn. It doesn't flare up like a normal fire. It travels through the root systems of trees, often started by lightning strikes, or sometimes a careless ember that slips into the soil. Once it's under there, it can burn for days, weeks, even without showing much on the surface. It's almost invisible, and because it moves underground, it can cover huge areas before anyone notices. We didn't talk much. Everyone just started working, digging down, spreading out, trying to find the edges of the burn. But the more we dug, the more we realized there weren't any clear edges. Every tree we checked, dozens of them, had some level of smoldering at the base. It was like we were sitting on top of a giant underground coal bed, and all it would take was a gust of wind or a dry lightning strike to turn the whole place into an inferno. The mood shifted fast. We weren't just checking on a weird tree anymore. We were in the middle of something serious. There were 20 or 30 scouts back at the main camp, not counting staff, and we were miles from any real help. No fire trucks could get in here in time if this blew up. We were on our own for the next few hours, maybe longer. We radioed in the danger, but signal out here was weak and unreliable. They started organizing an evacuation just in case, and meanwhile we kept digging. The tools weren't enough. We started using whatever we had, canteens, cooking pots, even bare hands. That's when I got the worst of the burns. I didn't even notice right away. I was so focused on exposing the glowing roots and trying to tamp out the spread that it took a while for the pain to register. By the time I did, my hands were already blistered, the skin tight and shiny like overcooked meat. It felt like a race against something we couldn't see. Every minute, the fire underground was moving. We tried to make fire breaks, trenches to isolate the areas we'd already exposed. We hauled buckets of water from a nearby stream, which wasn't much more than a trickle. It steamed and hissed when it hit the hot soil, but it wasn't enough. We didn't have the gear. No real fire suppression tools, no water tanks. Just shovels, hands, and desperation. By the time the sun dipped low, painting everything in gold and orange, we were covered in ash, sweat, and soot. The kids were evacuated to a secondary site, about 3 miles north, across a rocky ridge. They handled it better than I thought they would. Maybe they didn't know how close we were to real disaster. Maybe it just felt like an adventure to them. Eventually, the Forest Service got word and sent a small team in smoke jumpers from another part of the range. They arrived that night by helicopter, landing on a flat stretch of granite a few ridges over. From there, they hiked in. Professionals, head to toe in gear that looked like armor compared to our shorts and camp t-shirts. They took over fast, setting up temperature probes, cutting deeper fire lines, spraying the area with chemical retardants. We stepped back, exhausted, blistered, and watching our patch of forest glow like a dying campfire in the night. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on a rock near the fire line with my hands bandaged and stinging. I watched the smoke drift up through the trees, lit by the moonlight. I thought about how quiet the fire had been. That's what stuck with me the most. Fires in our heads are loud and fast, but this one crept like it had all the time in the world. It burned in silence, beneath our feet, out of sight until it was almost too late. Over the next few days, the fire crew stayed. They brought in more people, more equipment. Eventually, they traced the ignition point to a lightning strike weeks earlier. The bolt must have hit a tree just right, igniting the roots underground. From there, it spread slow and steady, under the duff and dirt, beneath the feet of campers and hikers who never knew it was there. The camp shut down for the season. Too risky. Even after the main smoldering was cleared, the risk of flare-ups remained. Insurance issues, Forest Service oversight didn't matter. Nobody was coming back that summer. The scars on my hands faded, but the deep blisters left their mark. I still feel the tightness in the skin sometimes when I grip something too hard. A reminder. But more than that, it changed how I looked at the forest. I used to see it as this grand, peaceful place. I still do, in a way. But I also know now that danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides just under the surface, quiet and patient, until you're already standing in it. I went back to that spot a year later just to see. The trees were still there. Most of them. Some had black scars around the bases, and a few had been cut down to stop flare-ups. The ground looked disturbed, like it had been ripped open and stitched back together again. There were new saplings growing, too. Life moving forward. The forest doesn't pause for long. But I stayed only a few minutes. I touched the earth with the back of my hand. Cool. Safe. This time. And then I walked away. I was about 10 years old when this happened. Maybe 11. It's hard to remember the exact age now, but I remember how it felt. That part never really faded. We were just kids, a small pack of boys trying to make the most out of the last weekend before school started again. My friend Matthias had a house near a forest, just outside a small town in Denmark. His parents were the type who trusted us maybe a little more than they should have, and they said we could camp in the woods behind their house as long as we stayed close. That little slice of forest wasn't massive or wild by any means, but to us, it was endless. It was our world. When you're 10 and you've got flashlights and sleeping bags and a forest to yourself, that's all you need. We set up camp in a small clearing not far from the edge of the trees, maybe a 15-minute walk from the house if you weren't in a hurry. There were 5 of us, and we used Matthias' old 2-man tent and a couple of tarps stretched between trees. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. We had brought soda, bags of candy, and even a little camping stove to heat hot dogs. No one brought real food, of course. We lived on sugar and whatever we could roast on a stick. That night, the trees were whispering in the breeze, and the stars blinked through the gaps in the leaves. The air was cool but not cold, just that right kind of crisp where you want to pull your sleeping bag up to your chin and zip it tight. We were gathered around a small fire we'd built, a bunch of us trying to act tough while we told stories. It always goes that way. You start with jokes, then ghost stories, and then someone tries to scare the others a little too much. That someone was me. I told them about the wolves, about how this forest, this very one, used to be the hunting ground of a pack of wolves that had escaped from somewhere. Some zoo or research station, I don't know, I made it up as I went. I told them they lived quiet and deep in the woods, far from any trail, smart and silent. They never barked. They didn't howl unless it was to each other. And they only did that when they'd found something. Or someone. I said they hunted in complete silence, their paws barely making a sound on the leaves, and they only came close to humans when they were really hungry. I think I had them for a moment. They were leaning in, wide-eyed and silent. But then Mads, one of the older boys, rolled his eyes and said, "There are no wolves in Denmark, you idiot." That broke the spell. Everyone laughed. I tried to argue back, tried to talk about sightings, how maybe they weren't native anymore, but that didn't mean they weren't out there. Wolves could cross borders. Wolves could survive if they were smart. But they were all already onto the next story, tossing empty soda cans and roasting marshmallows. That's when I did it. I cupped my hands around my mouth and let out a long, low howl. I tried to sound deep and real like those howls you hear in movies. It echoed a bit in the trees, rolled out into the night. I figured they'd laugh again, maybe throw a stick at me, but they didn't, because a few seconds later we heard another howl. This one wasn't me. It wasn't anyone around the fire. It came from deeper in the woods, maybe 50 or 60 meters in, just far enough that we couldn't see anything. The sound was sharp and real, drawn out and bone deep. It was followed a few seconds later by another, then a third, not overlapping, but spaced, like they were answering each other. No one laughed that time. We just sat there, eyes wide, neck stiff, listening. The fire crackled and popped. The wind rustled the leaves above, but we didn't hear anything else. First, then there was the sound of movement, leaves crunching, just one step, then another, not fast but steady, like something walking. I was frozen. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. My chest felt tight and my stomach flipped. I wanted to believe it was a joke, that one of the older boys had planned this, that someone was hiding in the woods, maybe one of the neighbor kids playing a prank. But the steps didn't sound like a person. They were too light, too careful, too deliberate. Then something snapped, a stick somewhere behind the fire. That was enough. We bolted. I don't remember who moved first, but once one of us ran, we all did. Flashlights forgotten, candy and bags and tarps left behind. We sprinted through the forest like the ground was on fire. Branches clawed at our arms. Roots caught our feet. I remember falling once, my hands smacking into the cold dirt, knees scraping over rocks. I scrambled up and kept going. My lungs burned. My heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. We didn't stop until we burst out of the trees and stumbled into Matthias' backyard. The porch light was still on. His parents must have been inside watching TV, completely unaware of the chaos happening a few hundred feet away. We crashed onto the grass, panting, shaking, not saying anything. Eventually, someone laughed, nervous and high-pitched. Then we all did. That kind of laugh that comes after a scare, when you're not sure if you're okay or if you're gonna throw up. We didn't go back for our stuff that night. We slept inside, packed into Matthias' living room like sardines. No one brought up the wolves again, at least not until the next day when the sun was high and warm and safe. We walked back into the woods in the morning, slower, more cautious, with our hands in our pockets and sticks in our hands. Everything was where we left it. The fire had died out on its own. Our sleeping bags were still there, candy wrappers rustling in the breeze. There were no tracks, no blood, no shredded tents or torn up gear, just some crushed underbrush where we must have bolted. That and one thing none of us could explain. A single empty beer can, dented and lying near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't ours. None of us brought beer. None of our parents would have allowed it. And this wasn't a kid's soda can. It was a full-size beer can, and it smelled like someone had just finished it the night before. That's when it clicked. It wasn't wolves. It wasn't anything wild. It was people. Drunk people, probably older teenagers or some group of guys messing around in the forest. Maybe they heard us, maybe they saw our fire and decided to scare us. The howling, the footsteps, it all made sense when you thought about it that way. No wolves, just dumb humans being dumb in the woods. But I'll tell you this, even now, years later, when I think back to that night, when I remember the way those howls echoed through the trees, the sound still sends a chill down my spine. I've heard people pretend to be wolves before. I've heard recordings, seen prank videos. Nothing ever sounded quite like what we heard. It was too clear, too perfect. Maybe it was just timing. Maybe our brains were wired for fear that night. Maybe the woods just made everything sound bigger and wilder than it really was. But no matter how many times I explain it away, a small part of me still wonders. Wonders if those drunk kids were reacting to something too. Wonders if we weren't the only ones being watched in that forest. I've camped many times since, in bigger woods, in darker, quieter places. But that night taught me something I've never forgotten. In the forest, it's never just you. Whether it's people, animals, or just the woods themselves breathing around you, there's always something else out there, watching, listening. And if you ever hear something howl back when you think you're alone, don't wait to find out what it is. Just run. When I was a teenager, probably around 15 or 16, one of my closest friends decided she wanted to have a birthday sleepover, but not the kind with movies and cake in someone's basement. She had something else in mind, something a little more adventurous. She lived on the edge of a small town, and behind her house stretched acres of woods. Not deep wilderness, but thick enough that when you walked even a few minutes in, the sounds of cars and people faded away. You could almost pretend you were out in the middle of nowhere. That's where she wanted us to camp for her birthday. There were 7 of us total, all girls, most of us from the same school. We were a tight group, always together during the day, always talking about boys, music, and whatever drama was going on in our small-town high school. We all showed up that Friday afternoon, backpacks loaded with sleeping bags, snacks, and extra hoodies. Her parents helped us carry her big tent, a 6 or 8 person one, and once we crossed her backyard and dipped into the trees, we walked about 1/8 of a mile in before settling on a spot. It wasn't the most professional campsite. We weren't experienced campers. It was more like, pick a flat spot, clear away the bigger sticks and rocks, and call it good. There was a little rise on one side and a small dip where the ground sloped slightly down toward a patch of ferns and fallen trees. You could still see the edge of her property way in the distance through the trees if you looked hard enough. But once we were set up and the fire was going, it felt like we were way out in the woods. We set up the tent near the fire pit area we made with a ring of stones. Her dad had helped us dig a little pit and showed us how to build a safe fire, then left us alone with one of those long fireplace lighters. We got the fire going, not big, but bright enough to see by, and we spent the afternoon laughing, roasting marshmallows, throwing chips at each other, and daring one another to go pee in the dark woods. We were young, full of energy, and nothing really scared us at that point. Not until later, anyway. By the time the sun dipped low and the woods went from dim to almost black, we were all tucked into the tent, sprawled in a circle with our sleeping bags and blankets like a big messy nest. The fire outside was still burning strong. Plenty of big logs and good coals, giving off a warm orange glow that flickered against the walls of the tent. It was just enough light to cast shadows that danced around while we sat inside telling ghost stories. You know, the kind of stories, local legends, things about haunted roads and people going missing. Things that probably weren't true but had just enough detail to feel real when you were sitting in the woods in the dark. We took turns trying to scare each other, whispering and then yelling the final punchline to get a good scream. It worked a few times. A couple of the girls were good at it, but we were still laughing after most of them, trying to act tough even when the hair on our arms stood up. Then we started hearing noises. At first, it was just a soft crunching sound, like twigs snapping. We thought it was one of us getting up to go pee or coming back. But we were all accounted for. The crunching got closer. Not fast, not loud, but steady. It circled a little like something walking around us. Someone joked it was a bear, and we all laughed a little too hard, trying to push away that creeping feeling that was settling in. The sound came closer, this time paired with something else. Sniffing, like a low, huffing inhale, right up against the side of the tent. All of us froze. Nobody said a word now. You could have heard a pin drop. The fire outside was still bright, casting the shadow of something large moving slowly around us. Every few seconds it would stop, and we could hear it breathing. It circled the tent again, and now it was clear whatever it was big, and it was curious. I remember thinking it can't be a person. It was too quiet, too smooth in its steps, and the way it sniffed, it didn't sound human. Then someone whispered, "There are bears here sometimes." And that was enough for me. I dove under the blankets like I was trying to disappear. I curled up in the very center of the tent, heart hammering, not even breathing loud. I didn't care if it was a bear or a monster or whatever. I just didn't want to see it. If I didn't look, maybe it wouldn't know I was there. That was my teenage brain logic. Hide, go still, make yourself small. One of the girls, though, Rainey, was built different. She had this no-nonsense attitude, didn't scare easy, and always acted like nothing fazed her. We called her the mom of the group because she was always ready to deal with things when the rest of us freaked out. While I was buried under 2 blankets in the fetal position, Rainey got up. We all heard the zipper on the tent slide open. For a second, we thought she was losing her mind. Then there was a loud rustle, a grunt, and the sound of something large bumping into the side of the tent. And then she laughed, like a real laugh, loud and surprised. The next sound was a deep, excited huffing, and then this wet, smacking sound. Something was licking her. We all peeked out just barely, and that's when we saw it. It was a dog. Not just any dog. It was the birthday girl's next-door neighbor's Great Dane. That dog was huge, taller than most of us when he stood on his hind legs. Solid black, eyes reflecting the firelight like 2 little mirrors. He'd shoved his massive head right into the tent and was happily licking Rainey's face like she was his long-lost best friend. She was trying to push him off, but he was too big and too excited. I sat up slowly, feeling my heart finally start to slow down, and even though I knew it was just a dog now, my hands were still shaking. One of the other girls started laughing. Then all of us joined in, this nervous, hysterical kind of laughter that you can only get after being scared out of your mind. The dog, his name was Max, we found out later, was just wagging his tail like it was the best night of his life. Apparently, he had run off earlier that day and wandered into the woods. He must have heard us, smelled the food, and come to check out what was going on. He scared the life out of us, but he didn't mean to. He was just curious. We let him stay with us after that. None of us wanted to send him away. It made us feel safer, having this huge dog lying by the fire outside. He barked once or twice at the trees, but nothing came near us after that. We stayed up late, talking low, every once in a while looking out at him to make sure he was still there. He eventually laid down right outside the tent like he was standing guard. By morning, Max was still there. He walked back with us to the house, trotting along like he belonged with us. When we called the neighbor, he came over with a leash and a big smile. He said Max had slipped his collar and took off the night before, and he'd been looking for him with a flashlight and calling his name. But Max had other ideas, apparently. We all walked back out to the woods later to grab the tent and clean up, and I still remember looking around the trees in the daylight. Everything looked so different. Nothing scary about it now. Just trees, leaves, the leftover ashes of our fire. No big shadows or sniffing sounds. But of course, I never lived it down. Every time we talked about that night, someone brought up how I buried myself under the blankets like I was 5 years old hiding from the boogeyman. They teased me for weeks, years even. Sometimes when we hung out, Rainey would just throw a blanket over my head and say, "There, you're safe now." Looking back, I can laugh too. But in that moment, when it was dark and quiet and something big was circling us, I was more scared than I'd ever been in my life. And I learned something that night. Sometimes it's not ghosts or monsters you have to worry about. Sometimes it's just a very large dog with bad timing and a love for marshmallows. I decided on a whim to take a break from everything and go camp along the Mississippi River in Illinois. The plan was simple. I needed to detox, clear my head, and escape the mess I'd gotten myself into. I'd been fighting a drug habit for a while, and I figured some time alone in the woods would do me good. It was about a 4-hour drive to get there, but the idea of having the whole wilderness to myself was appealing, and I wasn't going to let anything stop me. I'd chosen an area managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. It wasn't a campground, just public land where camping was free. It sounded perfect. No people around, no rules, just me, nature, and some time to figure things out. I was looking for some kind of solitude, something raw and real, without any distractions or responsibilities. I wanted to clear my mind, be still, and not have to worry about anything. I arrived in the late afternoon, and it was already starting to look like rain. I found a nice spot near the river, a secluded area just far enough off the trail where I felt safe, but close enough to the water that I could hear the soft rush of the current. It was a peaceful place, just me and the trees. I quickly got to work setting up camp. The rain was starting to pick up, so I set up my tent first, then got a small fire going, just to ward off the chill. I didn't have much for firewood, but the wet logs burned slow enough to keep a steady flame. The fire wasn't the most impressive, but it would do for a night. The rain grew heavier, and I had to put the fire out and settle in. I crawled into the tent, the sound of raindrops on the fabric making everything feel even more isolated. It was quiet in a way that made me feel disconnected, like I was the only person in the world. I remember thinking about how nice it was to be out there, away from everything. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. I stretched out on the ground, the damp earth seeping through my sleeping bag, but I didn't care. I was exhausted and ready to sleep. But then I woke up. It wasn't a loud sound, nothing violent, just rustling. It was close to my tent, almost like someone was moving around just outside. I lay still for a moment, trying to process what I was hearing. The wind? An animal? But it didn't sound like either. I was immediately alert, the adrenaline rushing through my body. I didn't move for a while, just listening. The rustling came again, then silence. My heart was racing. I waited a bit longer, straining my ears. There was something unsettling about the quiet that followed the rustling. I decided to check it out, but I didn't want to make any noise. I slowly unzipped the door of my tent, careful not to draw attention. The first thing I saw was a pair of eyes staring back at me. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, person. His face was covered in scars, disfigured in ways I couldn't understand. His skin had that strange, rough texture, almost like it was diseased. I could tell immediately that something wasn't right. But what stood out the most was how close he was. He was no more than 10 feet away from the door of my tent, just standing there, staring at me. When I opened the flap and looked outside, our eyes met. I froze. I had no idea what to do. Part of me was terrified, the other part of me was just confused. Why was he here? What did he want? But there was no immediate danger. He wasn't rushing at me or shouting. He just stood there, looking at me. After a long, uncomfortable moment, he finally spoke, his voice gruff and distant. It was like he had just noticed me for the first time, even though we were staring at each other. He started talking about the rain and how it had kept him up too, how the weather was always unpredictable here by the river. I was still too startled to respond, but I nodded along, not sure what else to do. He wasn't threatening or aggressive. His tone was strangely calm, almost casual, like we were old friends having a conversation. But his face, those scars, made the situation feel anything but normal. He didn't seem to mind the silence between us, and after a few moments, he walked a little closer, still looking at me with those unsettling eyes. He seemed harmless, but the weirdness of the whole situation made me uneasy. We talked for a while, maybe an hour or more. I remember him offering me some of his food. He had rice and beans cooking over a small fire nearby. He spoke about survival in the wilderness, how he had learned to live off the land. He told me he'd been living out here for years, just getting by, moving from place to place. He had a bicycle covered in snake skins, which he seemed really proud of. He showed me his collection of animal hides, squirrel, rabbit, deer. He had traps set up in the area, and he told me about how he could catch nearly anything. He asked me for a cigarette several times during our conversation, even though I kept telling him I didn't smoke. Every time I said no, he would offer something in return. His hobo stove was the first thing he offered. He was convinced it was the best stove ever made, and that it could cook anything, anywhere. He was eager to show me how it worked. I tried to be polite, but his offer was unsettling. Something about the way he spoke was just off. He seemed a little off, too. It wasn't just the way he looked, it was the way he spoke, how he jumped from topic to topic without ever really finishing a thought. He talked about hunting and trapping, and then he went on about how animals had special energy, and how by eating them you could absorb that energy. He spoke like it was a deep truth, like he had unlocked some secret to the universe. It wasn't just a hobby for him, it was his life. He said that by eating the flesh of animals, he could take their strength and intelligence. The more he spoke, the more the conversation became twisted and surreal. But there was more. The things he said about gaining power from others disturbed me. At first, I thought he was joking, but as he kept talking, I realized he wasn't. He talked about the energy he could gain by raping his victims. I don't know how to explain it, but the way he said it, how casually he mentioned it, made me want to run. He wasn't talking about just humans. He was talking about animals too, as though it was all part of some sick ritual. I tried to ignore the dark undertones of his words, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in over my head. The more he spoke, the more the unease in my stomach grew. I knew I had to get away from him. He wasn't physically threatening, he wasn't big or strong, but I couldn't trust him. I didn't know what he might do if he got any crazier. The whole situation felt wrong, like I was in a scene from some twisted nightmare, but I wasn't sure how to get away without making him angry. The sun began to set, and the shadows grew long across the camp. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the only sound breaking the tense silence between us. I decided that I needed to leave. I didn't care how far I had to drive. I just needed to get away from him, from that place. I told him I was going to town to grab some cigarettes, that I'd be back soon. He seemed thrilled, like he hadn't expected me to leave. He waved me off, his strange smile stretching across his scarred face. I got in my car as quickly as I could, not looking back. My heart was pounding as I drove away, the sound of his voice still echoing in my ears. I drove across the river to Clinton, Iowa, a town I'd never been to before. It was a shitty little place, full of empty streets and rundown buildings. I found a casino, wasted $5, and went to sleep in my car in a park next to a playground. It felt safer there, though I still couldn't shake the images of the man and his twisted ramblings. The next morning, I woke to the sound of children playing. It was surreal, like everything had gone back to normal, but I knew I wasn't the same. The whole experience had left me rattled, and I realized how close I'd come to a real disaster. I got in my car and drove home, the sun rising behind me, casting light on the road ahead. The trip was ruined, but in a way, I was glad it was over. I had learned my lesson. Some solitude isn't worth the price you pay. Some places aren't as safe as they seem, no matter how far you think you've run. I've spent most of my life at our family cabin in northern Michigan. Technically, it's not really a cabin. It's an old, weather-beaten mobile home that's been parked in the woods for years. My grandparents got it back in the 80s, and over the years, my parents inherited it. My dad would always joke about how we were camping in luxury because of the roof over our heads, but in reality, the mobile home is barely hanging on. The walls creak with every gust of wind, the pipes freeze when it gets too cold, and the electrical box outside is always a problem. But it was always our place to escape, a spot to get away from the chaos of life. Until recently, everything about the cabin felt familiar, comforting even. That was until the weird stuff started happening. It started a few months ago when I was up there with my family. We'd been hearing strange noises at night, things that couldn't be explained by the usual wildlife in the area. At first, it was just a couple of bumps or creaks, but it escalated. One night, we all heard something tapping on the window. We assumed it was a raccoon or something else, but when we went outside to check, nothing was there. My parents dismissed it as animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. Then, just a couple of weeks ago, I decided to go up again with my friend, hoping a weekend getaway could calm my nerves. We arrived late, just as the sun was setting, and as usual, the place was quiet. Too quiet. It's not unusual for there to be no one else around for miles. We unloaded our bags and started fiddling with the electrical box outside. The lock had frozen shut, which wasn't surprising. It happens often in the cold winters. We pulled and tugged, but the lock refused to budge. We could hear rustling from the trees behind the cabin, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then the rustling grew louder, closer. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was nothing, but then I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching in the dry leaves and snow. I glanced at my friend, who was already looking uneasy. Neither of us said a word, but we both knew it wasn't just an animal. We weren't alone. We tried to get the lock to work again, but the noise around us was growing. It was like something or someone was circling us just beyond the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. I was no longer thinking about the electricity or the frozen lock. All I could focus on was the oppressive silence between each crack of the leaves underfoot. Then it stopped. The rustling went completely still, like the thing that had been out there was waiting for us. We didn't stick around to find out. We grabbed a couple of essentials and rushed inside, locking the door behind us. The inside of the cabin felt suffocating, and I knew neither of us could shake the feeling that something was off. I suggested we drive into town, get a motel for the night, and come back in the morning when the sun was up. We could try to get the electricity on then. At least we would have some light and hopefully some safety. The drive to town was quick, but the further we got, the more unsettled I became. I kept telling myself that it was just nerves, that nothing bad could happen. We parked outside the motel, grabbed our bags, and tried to relax. But there was a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. When we got back to the cabin after spending the night in the motel, the unease had only grown. It was still early in the morning, and the trees around the cabin were bathed in the soft orange glow of the sunrise. We figured we would check on the car first and then start working on getting the lock open. That's when things got worse. I walked over to my car, still parked in the same spot where we'd left it the night before. The engine had started without issue when we left the motel, so I expected no problems now. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. I turned it again, then a third time, but the car wouldn't start. The dashboard was dead. Not a single light flickered. The locks on the doors wouldn't even respond. It was like the car was completely shut down. I felt the blood drain from my face. What the hell? My friend came over to the car, and we both tried everything. We turned the key, popped the hood, checked the battery, even tried rolling the car back and forth to see if we could get something to work. But nothing. The car was absolutely unresponsive. "What do we do?" my friend asked, her voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. My car had been perfectly fine just a few hours ago. I'd driven it 3 hours without a hitch, and now, in the short time we'd been inside the cabin, something had gone terribly wrong. We decided to go back inside the cabin. If the car wasn't starting, there was no way we could drive to town for help. We locked the door behind us. The silence that followed felt even thicker than before. Something wasn't right, and we both knew it. We tried to stay calm, made a game plan. The only thing we could do now was wait until daylight and then try to walk in the direction of the nearest town to get a signal or find someone who could help. But as we sat there, trying to come up with ideas, the first knock came. 2 sharp, loud raps on the back door. We froze. For a moment, neither of us moved, unsure if we had heard it correctly. But there it was again, 2 knocks, crisp and deliberate. My heart raced in my chest. I looked at my friend, who was pale and wide-eyed. No one had been near the cabin. We were miles from anyone. The idea that someone was out there, someone who had been messing with our car, sent a cold chill down my spine. The knocks stopped as suddenly as they had started. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. I was ready to scream, but I couldn't. We waited, hoping that whoever it was would just leave. But then came another sound, this time a sharp bang on one of the windows. Couldn't breathe. The thud was so loud it vibrated through the walls. We both jumped, and our eyes locked in sheer terror. The window was only a few feet away from where we were sitting. Whoever was out there had made it close. Too close. The banging continued, one loud smack against the window after another. I didn't know how long we sat there, but it felt like hours. My entire body was stiff with fear. The only thing we could do was stay quiet and pray that whoever was out there didn't try to break in. It wasn't a real house. It was a mobile home. The walls were thin and the windows were flimsy. It wouldn't take much to get in. The knocks on the window continued. Every time the sound echoed in the room, I flinched. We didn't sleep. We didn't talk. We just sat there, awake, listening for any more sounds. When the sun finally rose, we wasted no time. We rushed outside, the morning light offering us a small comfort. But the sense of unease didn't go away. We checked the car first. I was hoping that somehow it had started working again, that this was all just some horrible, horrible mistake. But no, when we popped the hood, we found what had been done. The bolt that clamped the metal piece to the battery terminal was nearly loose. It wasn't completely off yet, but it was so close. Just one or two more turns and the car would have been completely disabled. Someone had done it on purpose. Someone had made sure we couldn't get out. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been knocking on our door, whoever had been messing with the car, had been toying with us. They had sabotaged the car and waited, enjoying our fear. They wanted to make sure we were trapped. But we weren't. We had survived the night and we were going to make it out. That thought was enough to keep me going. And when we finally got the car started, when we drove away from that cabin, I didn't look back. But I'll never forget the silence of that place. The way it felt like something was always just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. And I'll never forget the fear, the feeling that someone or something was playing with us, making sure we knew we weren't alone.